Tonight in class. I know it's not ideal to be in the 7 p.m. Friday night class, but bear with us. It'll be short and sweet tonight. Tonight we will be talking about the minimum wage policy and why it is at the forefront of a lot of legislation in recent days, also in past. We will just be dissecting this policy just with a more close magnifying glass, and we will be looking into the ins and outs of this policy and seeing and understanding it and really being able to apply it to the future and also to enhance our knowledge. So we can just start off with a little introduction about the minimum wage debate and why it is at the forefront. The minimum wage debate in Ontario has intensified in the following years with an increase from $16.55 to $17.30 per hour in October 2024. This policy adjustment is aimed to support workers, but it has been resignated in discussion about the adequacies of minimum wage and if it is applying and providing a living wage as well. The Ontario Living Wage Network argues that even in the increase, the minimum wage falls short of $7.85 of what is considered a livable wage in many regions. The discrepancy between minimum wage and a living wage is particularly stark in the center of Toronto, as the Ontario Living Wage Network describes it and calculates it as a living wage should be more as $25.05. This calculation does actually consider the cost of shelter, food, and transportation, which have significant increases in recent years due to inflation. The gap between minimum wage and the living wage is not unique to Torontonians, as the Ontario Living Wage Network would describe it and report it as. The province-wide minimum wage is lower than a little minimum wage in every region in Ontario, with the lowest wage falling in the southwestern region of Ontario at being a stark $18.65. This policy issue has a far-reaching implication for Ontario workforces and the economy, and nearly 1 million workers do struggle to meet ends meet due to high costs and the lack of increase in minimum wage. While Ontario government still try to doubt that this is not a important issue, it is one of the highest critiques that does meet a lot of people's inquiries of why people are not making this as sufficient as it should be, because it should be sufficient to meet basic needs. Now we will be moving on to how this policy issue came onto the public agenda. According to the Who's Hungry report by the Daily Bread and the North York Harvest, food bank visits have skyrocketed by 51% between April 2022 and March 2023, reaching over 2.5 million visits. Regarding these food banks, Ryan Noble, the CEO of the North York Harvest, stated that we are in a crisis as Toronto, as a city, and we are in danger as a community. This surge on food insecurity has brought an inadequacy of the minimum wage into sharp relief, as even full-time workers struggle to make basic ends meet. Even Craig Pickthorne, the director of the Ontario Living Wage Network, has articulated that the core issue is that there is no way you can work a minimum wage full-time job and pay all of your bills. The statement does resonate with a lot of Ontarians, including people like Bridget Martin, who relied on social assistance until recently. The Ontario Living Wage Network's calculations show that minimum wage falls short in every region of Ontario, as we've said above, which further amplifies public concern. Many political figures and opposing parties have sees that this issue is a public concern. NDP leader Merritt Stiles emphasizes that we need to adjust the base to reflect reality and tie it to inflation, highlighting that current minimum wage is a base far too low for where the people are. Even the Green Party, Anson Clancy, who represents the Kitchener Centre, where the living wage is calculated to be $20.90 an hour, pointed that there is an interconnected housing affordability issue here. It needs to be brought to the attention, and I would like to make it known that minimum wage is not just a debate due to the numbers, but it's also about the quality of life of the public in the significant portion of the Ontario's population. The doubling of food usage within the past year has served as a stark representation that this is a severe issue that policymakers, the government, and the public just cannot simply ignore anymore. I did want to move on to our third section, which would be the policy response and how it is adapted by decision makers. However, I do want to backtrack a little bit so that it can kind of help our understanding. So for starters, we can start with the Kathleen Wynne administration, how in earlier days they did implement a substantial minimum wage increase from $11 $13.60 in 2017 to $14 per hour on January 1st, 2018. This did represent a significant spike in minimum wage in recent years compared to the more 15 to 20 cent annual increases. And this did plan to set workers up for a minimum wage of $15 per hour, which was part of a broader strategy to address inequality incomes. Unfortunately, the Doug Ford administration, the PCP, did take over, and they did freeze the minimum wage at $14 per hour, delaying further increases, and then they did later adopt a different style in trying minimum wage increases to the consumer price index to account for the inflation. And as of October 2024, the minimum wage did increase to $17.30 per hour versus the most recent price increase, which was in October 2023. I was at work when this happened, I do remember. And that price back then was $16.55. We can also move on to more of the policy implications and the criticisms. And honestly, let's also try to reiterate that it is still not enough, and that is also been reiterated by the Ontario Living Wage Network, and you will hear me going back to that. This is not a livable wage that we are at right now, and us as a community and a society do have a lot more growing to do. And despite that this response, Ontario does demonstrate that this minimum wage does present challenges in balancing the economic and considerations of the pressing needs to ensure that workers can afford basic living. While incremental increases have been implicated, the debate still continues on whether this can measure up to the disparities between a minimum wage and a livable wage. Great. I would honestly love to move on to the fourth part of this dissection that we are performing right now, and this fourth part would consider the actors, institutions, and the ideas as a whole of this policy implementation. Let's start off with the actors as a first. Right off the bat, we could name Kathleen Wynne. They implemented the significant minimum wage increases. Premier Doug Ford, who adjusted the approaches and tying the increases to the consumer price index. Also, oppositional parties, such as the NDP leader, Marit Stiles, who advocated for the base wage to reflect the reality, and the Green Party's representative, Anson Clancy, who did highlight the interconnections like housing affordability and how it ties to minimum wage increases. We can also delve deeper and we can look at labor organizations and small businesses such as mom and pop shops that could suffer from things as of this. We can also take a second look at institutions. For institutions, we can start up with naming the Ontario Living Wage Network that calculates and promotes the living wages and standards across the provinces, government ministries that are responsible for implementing and overseeing minimum wage policies as a whole, and food banks like the Daily Bread and the North York Harvest that provide us with the data and the statistics we need to understand that a minimum wage increase is actually a problem, and we need to grasp that this is something that needs to be dealt with today and not tomorrow. We can thirdly move on to our ideas, and we can consider the living wage concept, the idea where wages should cover the living expenses of basic needs and necessities in all regions and provinces. We can also consider the economic impacts, which is the balancing of workers' needs with concerns about business viability and economic sustainability. We can also transfer over into the social equity, which is addressing the growing income of inequality, ensuring workers can meet basic needs. I do understand that I have been tying it back to basic needs, but it's important to understand that that is a very big umbrella of why minimum wage is on the table in the first place. Canadians should be able to live beyond their means or live comfortably within the means that they have, not stretching themselves thin just to make ends meet. It's important to understand that these complex roles play a very, very important part in our economic, social, and political factors in shaping the minimum wage policy. The ongoing debate involving balancing worker needs, business concerns, and broader economics all impact the changing public opinions and political landscapes of Canada as a whole. Amazing. We can move on to the fifth segment of our presentation today, and this is where we will be talking about how by which the means of this policy were carried out. I would like to break that into three sections today. The first section would be the legislative action. This section talks about the government's introduction of the amendments to existing labor laws to adjust the minimum wage. Also, with future increases tied to the Consumer Price Index to account for inflation, with bills such as Bill 148, the Fair Workplace Better Jobs Act of 2017, being a significant piece of legislation that did include minimum wages. We could move on to the enforcement of compliances, which is my section 2, which is where we would talk about the Ministry of Labor, who was tasked with enforcing minimum wage laws in the first place. With the increased inspections and audits were implemented to ensure employer compliances, and penalties for non-compliances were established and or increased. We can also move on to the third section, which is what I would like to describe as supporting programs, where the government initiated programs to assist workers in finding higher paying jobs and longevity in full-time jobs for that matter. The government also implemented skill training and education that were launched to improve employability and the skill sets of our employers in general. We can also move on to engagement and worker groups with the municipality to address the related issues like housing affordability. Great, let's move on to the last and final product of our entire evaluation as a whole, and this would be how this policy response was evaluated, actually. We can break that into 3 parts like we have been doing this entire time, and the first part that I would like to dissect is the annual review process, and this is a process that was implemented by Ontario's government to understand and outline the Employment Standards Act, and this process ties to minimum wage increases and Ontario's inflation levels, by also using the Consumer Price Index as a benchmark to understand the fluctuations of minimum wage and how it will increase in the future. We can also move on to the comparative analysis of this element, and this is where this policy's effectiveness is partly evaluated by comparing Ontario's minimum wage with other provinces. As we already know, Ontario's minimum wage right now is at a standing $17.30 per hour and is the second highest in Canada, just behind British Columbia's. As we can move forward with this, we can move on to the economic impact of this analysis. And this is where this analysis would be evaluated based on its economic impacts. As just said, for example, it can be shown that 3.9% of the increase in 2024 translates to an additional $1,355 in annual earnings for full-time employees working 40 hours per week at a general minimum wage. This analysis can help us assess the policy's contributions to workers' well-being. Honestly, I was going to read off my notes for this ending, but I don't think I will, actually. I think I'm going to say it all from my own thoughts of just reading back on what we've done so far in this class and how policy has truly shaped what we do in every single day and age as we know it, but especially when it comes into minimum wage, being able to really see the ins and outs of minimum wage as a whole and understanding that it's actually a lot more complex than people think it is and people say it is at the end of the day. And it's interesting to see that this evaluation applies a very comprehensive view to this policy and the effectiveness of its challenges and how it remains to be fully addressed at the forefront of our day and age. And I think that this is going to be something that's on the agenda for a very long time, because it's always interesting to see how the governments and policymakers try to, I wouldn't say diminish isn't the correct word, but it's just interesting on how society is still kept so small because the money's there. It's just, when are we going to do something with it? And I wanted to leave everybody with the question at the end of this, especially with reflecting on the landscapes of the Ontario minimum wage policy as a whole. A crucial question does spark my mind, and that question would be, how can policymakers effectively bridge the growing gap between minimum wages of living and the minimum wage in general across the diverse regions of Ontario, while balancing the new needs of workers, small businesses, and the broader economy in an era of rapidly changing labor markets and increasing cost of living pressures? I want to know if we as a society are able to do it. It's interesting. Thank you so much for listening, and thanks so much for coming to class.